Hello, everyone. This is Aran. I'm an educator of philosophy based in Austin, Texas. Today, I will have a conversation with my great friend, Tren, or Dr. Gan.
Fully drop it. Okay, hi. Hi everybody, my name is Tran, and no, please don't. It's just Tran, it's fine. I'm cultural historian for early medieval Europe and late medieval China, and based in Austin, Texas for now, and will move to Houston very soon. So glad to be with y'all today. Yeah.
Uh, uh, as a matter of kind of like giving us, providing context for our listeners of where we are, why we are here, very brief summary of what we have done. We are still in the process of engaging with the concept of human nature. Like we are following that path, following that research paradigm, and we have talked about evolutionary psychology in details, discussing the foundational text in evolutionary psychology, and we have provided a summary of evolutionary psychology that also deals with a certain like response that evolutionary psychology might have to some of its critiques. That summary was based on David Bueller's book Adapting Minds, which is our focus in this series. And now we're ready to kind of embark on our engagement with Bueller's criticism of evolutionary psychology. 2 points. Bueller's criticism of evolutionary psychology is sympathetic still to the broader project of evolutionary psychology. So there is a capital evolutionary psychology, P, and there is like lowercase evolutionary psychology, and the latter is concerned with certain figures that have become popular both in the academic circles and as popular public intellectuals associated with evolutionary psychology. But sorry, that was the former, the EP with the capital, and the lowercase evolutionary psychology, the latter is the general project of trying to put the human behavior and human existence in general in the context of evolutionary biology. And Bueller is sympathetic to the idea that evolutionary biology has a lot to say about how we should think about humanity, but he is not so sympathetic to that group of thinkers like Steven Pinker, Boss, Cosmides, and Tooby that follow a specific path in evolutionary psychology. The way that we're gonna talk about this, and the way that the book itself is structured, just to give you a very broad context, is that there are certain chapters in the book that are kind of theoretical considerations that Bueller is interested in. And there are some chapters that are about, challenging the specific like experimentations and that, or like empirical studies that evolutionary psychologists cite to provide evidence for their position. Our main focus in our discussions is going to be the theoretical sides, but we think these theoretical, quote unquote, theoretical sides are necessarily empirical challenges as well. Like there are certain points that certain criticism that Bueller provides that are just very much disrupt any even process of empirical data gathering in some cases. Trent, do you have anything about the introduction, or should we just jump right in?
We should just jump right in. Yes, I think so.
Perfect. So, amongst all the issues that Bueller raises against evolutionary psychology, that, by the way, at the end of this series, we're going to critically engage with those. For now, where we are reporting to you like what those criticisms are, is one category of that distinction is we can call epistemic obstacles. The epistemic obstacles relate to the problem of ancestral environment, right? The epistemic issues, in other words, are the issues that pertain to the problem of reconstructing the ancestral environment in which evolutionary psychologists claim our adaptive mechanisms were developed. These problems are roughly categorized in three subcategories. Like there's the main category of epistemic obstacles. There are three subcategories, and each of them kind of shed light on one specific type of a problem that exists with evolutionary psychologists' understanding of this ancestral environment. It is also important to mention, and I will bring this up again in the critical remarks, that the structure of the book is not very, like, a lot of times these kind of points are scattered around, or they're not really kind of like, there is no like a specific chapter dedicated to like misidentified problems as a problem with reconstructing the ancestral environment. We are kind of like reconstructing the book and giving it a structure that makes sense for our purpose. It's just like as a context if you are familiar with the book or you are engaging with the book itself. Okay, we have three problems: misidentified problems, the arms race of adaptation, and the key lock fallacy. Trent, why don't you put us through the journey of understanding the problem of identification?
Yes, we subdivided this to the misidentified problem obstacles, one of the three epistemic obstacles, into two sections. One is called the coercifying problems. The other is called, let me check it out, circulative reasoning. And just to back up a little bit, in the previous two episodes, we talked about the overarching premises of the evolutionary psychologist as the paradigm. Namely, there is something called ancestral environment on one hand, and the adapted human mind on the other hand. And the reason we think and behave as human beings in such a cross-cultural way right now is because things happen in a long period of human evolution, namely the Pleistocene period, where hunter-gathering groups was the dominant form of human existence, and the problems of selective pressure, adaptive problems faced by our ancestors, our shared ancestors, very importantly, are the concrete venues where we can interpret this interaction between the environment and the human mind. Yet during this process, there's something really interesting because it reminds me of my personal research, in the sense, like, whenever you, as a cultural historian, I try to use social or anthropological theory to guide my research, some like old or like very stubborn philologist or textual scholar would always come to me and say, no. You are imposing your category back to that group of people you are studying. They are not dealing with your problem. Those are your problems. This is precisely the problem we are dealing with here, coercifying problems. For instance, one very important pan-human adaptive problem, according to evolutionary psychology, is that of like mating, for instance. Like, in order to like gain mate, say females, according to them, are tentative to male status, so they constantly seek potential spouse or mate with higher status. But if you're really living in such a hunter-gathering society, status is not a category used to identify, and your whole, like, whatever psychological mechanism, so to speak, are not guide you towards specifically the concept of status. Instead, you're looking at something extremely concrete, like being a better singer. A better singer is a better mate, or like a better designer, a better poet is a mate, so to speak. So this kind of category, like seeking mate based on higher status, is a very general, broad, or coarse, in Bueller's language, problem identified and defined by evolutionary psychologists. And we use such a thing to lump very concrete case together and say, oh, they're all dealing with the same thing. Yet, this is used also to connect not just hunter-gatherer groups of the past, but also other venues where evolutionary psychology sort of draw the evidence from. To very briefly summarize it, it's also in very detailed, it's engaged in detail in Buehler's book. Evolutionary psychology uses three approaches to extract and construct the data to reconstruct such ancestral environment. First, through design function analysis. We have certain tendency observed in our time, therefore we can back engineer the exact problem. Second is hunter-gatherer studies, because we still have hunter-gatherer communities in our time. We can go and observe their behaviors, and they, according to evolutionary behaviors, are evolutionary relics which preserved our ancestral problems. That's why we have such a line on the slide at the very end. A third one is through primate studies, essentially, because chimpanzees and the human ancestors shared like ancestors a few million years back. So by observing their social behavior, so we could infer certain problems shared by human ancestors and their ancestors through the process of abstracting. But for Buehler, this process is not, it's problematic in the sense that the category generated based on these methods might well not be meaningless to the individuals living in the community we try to generalize from. And simply saying, for example, like seeking mated with higher status is not the kind of direct message mind is delivering to like one's body. Like they are not looking for seeking status. The status itself is constructed in very culture and environment specific way, and they obligates individuals to look at the completely different features. So that's the first, of course, to find problem mismatch as half of the misidentified problems. Any thoughts on that, Aran, before we proceed?
Yes, I think there is something potentially fertile, intellectually speaking, in this misidentification problem and in this layer of the corresponding distinction. Because I think it's part of it is just about how natural selection functions, right? Natural selection based on what was an established science of biology is not the type of a process that could deal with an abstract general problem like a mating problem. Insofar as our biological development is concerned, there is no such a problem as a mating problem. The problems that exist are very specific, concrete issues that happen within a group within a population, right? So if suddenly, for whatever reason, the people who have better voices are more reproductively successful, then that just is kind of become part of that cumulative retention over time. Then if like there is something else that is contributing to reproduction that seems absolutely unrelated to that, having a better vision, then that also is going to be retained. Also, being a better singer is a multifaceted capacity, right? And it might be responding to all sorts of problems, and one of which is like the mating problem, quote unquote, the mating problem, right? Finding a reproductive partner. So I think the most important thing here is to realize that we are constructing a problem called a mating problem and apply that category to like 50 million things that have happened, right? That's not how natural selection functions. It's not a God that it just looks like that, okay, we've got like this group of people. I have this kind of a omnipotent, omnipresent existence. I know what's happening. These people have a mating problem. So let's grant them this specific mechanism that works with mating problems. That's not how natural selection works. And that itself could be a point of contention, right? Like, meaning that evolutionary psychologists can come back and say, no, that's exactly how natural selection works. But that requires an argument. That requires, I think, a radical reconsideration of what natural selection is all about. The whole thing about natural selection is that it doesn't have a grand plan. There is no grand plan. There are very, very concrete problems, and there are very, very concrete answers to those problems that later on we can kind of have like a map things out that, you know, maybe this is contributing to this, but that basically is not that kind of a, that it's the idea of a mating problem is not matching that. Natural selection is all about fine problems. Coarse problems are our construction of some pattern in those fine problems. But there is no singular mating problem to be solved. And that could change the whole structure of how we understand this relationship.
Yes, that's a great point, and that inspires me to cover something I meant to say but didn't. I think this problem, coarse fine, is directly connected with a really important quality introduced by evolutionary psychologists, namely multi-modularity, that the way human mind develops in response to the environment, the adaptive problems that in our ancestral environment is domain specific, and the mechanism we have corresponds to one specific domain which has its own specific problem. So those things are interesting, but because it tries to be both at the same time universal and specific. But for based on what you summarize, for natural selection, they are not specific enough in the sense that the kind of mating problem or whatever a mechanism they propose is not good enough as a way to direct individual behaviors. Yet on the other hand, they could not go even more specific. They cannot say only go to this specific village at this specific time, this specific problem. Because if they do that, then they cannot maintain the universality of it. So they're going to the most granular level already, but it's still too coarse from the viewpoint of natural selection.
I think that's an excellent point, and I think it kind of reveals a very interesting kind of contradiction. Maybe I'm not sure if that's the name, but I think this is the problem that evolutionary psychologists have with domain general, brain. They think this is not specific enough to solve our specific problems. I think from this kind of formulation of corresponding problems, we're approaching that from the position of agreement, in the sense that yes, exactly, we have very specific problems to solve, right? But they are far more specific than being about mating problems. There are this specific type of singing within this population during a flooding period of like Earth, with this specific other things about like the monkeys in their environment. That's the problem, right? And as we're going to see, because the problems that human beings face are so specific, that there could be an argument for a modified version of a domain general brain, right? That in a weird way, exactly because problems are going to be hyper specific, the multimodularity idea cannot hold. I think we have said enough for this right now. We are going to revisit this, and of course, I think it's followed from what both of us said, that there is no such a thing. Just as there is no general mating problem, there is no ideal hunter-gatherer population either. And these are going to kind of get intertwined. Like these are two sides of the same problem. As there is no mating problem, there is no ideal hunter-gatherer society with a mating problem to kind of point at. Extant hunter-gatherers or like whatever populations various study. Good. I think we should move to the second phase. Trent.
Yes, and the second problem within misidentified problem is the circularity of a problem solution, because this problem thing is postulated rather than observed. There's no way for us to like use time machine to fly back to ancestral environment and really observe and talk to, if we can, our ancestors, and ended up figure out their problems. Those problems were back engineered, so to speak. So we start really with, as I just mentioned, the three different ways: primary studies, and a study of the hunter-gatherers, or certain educated hypothesis based on the specific faculties already established, say language. We conjecture a picture of the problems. So one very important way to go about to reconstruct the problem is to start with a solution. And so using alleged adaptive solutions as the starting point, then we end up requires us to already know much about that ancestral environment. Otherwise, we cannot know what this is solution. The solutions entail function, like we are already dealing with that environment. But that's precisely what we don't know. Because if we know that already, we already know the concrete adaptive problems. So there is a circularity of reasoning here. So we conjecture certain problems by assuming certain adaptive solutions are answers to those problems. And based on accumulation of such knowledge, we construct, on the one hand, a normal ancestral environment, on the other hand, the composition or the anatomy of a human mind. So that's the problem of circularity pointed out by Buhler.
Yes, and just to add something very kind of tiny to what you said, like the reverse engineering method, right? That's the idea here. I think the idea that is why the parallel doesn't work is that when you are you are in China or you're in Iran and a technology is developed in the West that you basically want to steal, right? And like the reverse engineering just kind of sometimes is used in that way. That like you get the final product that exists, you kind of took it to the parts and you kind of understand how this came about, right? Like how we have this final product. But noticing that situation, how much we already know what we are doing. Like we know the function of this product, and we know so many limitations that exist that connects the origin of the product with the function of the product. That's not the case with human behavior, because if I say, for instance, human beings have, let's say, female human beings, we go and study female human beings, and we see that female human beings have like a sensitivity to smell, like a specific type of smell they identify better than males, based on a frequency study. Um, that's great. We got it. Now, if we want to say this is something related to the ancestral environment, then we should start by saying this. The reason this exists, it is the fact that this capacity or this ability is a solution to something. Now let's go reconstruct the ancestral environment and see what the problem was. But why think that was a solution to anything, number one? Number two, why was a solution in that specific period? It seems like this is like a stacked argument. We have already, of course, if you already assume this is a solution that was devised in a specific period, then you will propose a problem that existed at that time that fits the solution. But that doesn't mean that that actually is true. The whole thing was assumed from the very beginning. Trent?
Yeah. I think while listening to your like very helpful recapitulation, I was thinking we might have benefited from backing up a little bit. So what are solutions? Like, let's follow their logical argument. We have solutions, so we back engineer to the problems, then we reconstruct the ancestral environment, right? That's the whole process. Solutions are stuff we generalize based on observation of certain things, say contemporary human behaviors. But so we generate certain dominant cultural or psychological traits, however you define them. But there's absolutely no way for us to tell adapted traits apart from non-adapted traits. Because you mentioned in the previous episode that evolution is not just about natural selection. There are a lot of noise in evolution. A lot of dominant traits or popular traits are here not because of adaptive problems or the natural selection process, just because what we call contingency. There was like a flood that killed a specific trait of alpha male. Therefore, that very helpful trait did not become dominant. Instead, some sub-ideal trait become dominant. So, but based on their reasoning, we have already figured out a way to tell adaptive traits from non-adaptive traits. And those adaptive traits are solutions to an ancestral problem. To make that connection, to give dominance or popularity or frequency distribution, whatever, a causal or functional cause requires a lot of knowledge about the environment where such dominant traits came to be in the first place. But that's precisely what we don't know. That's why we need to back engineer. Yes, I think, for instance, the analogy you said about like China and Iran sometimes smuggle certain final product of a weapon and try to back engineer is because they already know so much about like modern weaponry and what military is about. The weapons drawn with like the bombs to its side, they are not for decorative purpose. They're for certain male alpha to like demonstrate his like status. Even though in our times for certain people that might well be the case, but like it's not how certain engineers in China or Iran are understanding that situation. There are already so many assumptions, and they learn such assumptions because they are in a globalized arm race environment and that they know how it operates. But we, 21st century, we don't know what a Pleistocene human beings environment. So that's why there's a circularity of problem solution. We need to know the problem in the first place to figure out the solution. But we are figuring out problems by back engineering from solutions. Yes.
Yes, exactly. Now, the second category of problem that we have, I really like this kind of metaphor, probably to a fault, and I have annoyed Trent by keep mentioning this, but it's the idea of an arms race. And this is for those of you who are engaged in the political affairs in the last century, you can kind of see how the parallel kind of unfolds and how it kind of informs a lot of fortunate and unfortunate aspects of our collective lives. Now, as a means for a metaphorical use for the problems that we're facing here, we can think about arms race of adaptation. Now, notice that one of the main points that evolutionary psychologists propose is that because of how difficult it is for genetic modifications, massive genetic modifications to exist within populations, when we are thinking about like psychological adaptations, what we need is some sort of stability. And in that a stable kind of like environment, psychological mechanism can evolve, and that's exactly what has happened. Now, the point that is very important in Buehler's view is that this really does not take into account that how much our quote-unquote adaptive problems are about the kind of co-development of strategies based on nothing but the social realities of human life. Let me expand on that. There are certain environmental limitations. You know, if we are living in a world with a certain like proportion of oxygen, certain landscapes, soil that functions in a certain way, a specific population of predators and prey within an environment, those are all kind of impacting one another, and they might have certain problems. Now, I don't know how like we can kind of radically like summarize the kind of permanence of problems, but I assume that in some cases, if you have like deers and the lions, right, they are in an environment. Both of these entities have problems, right? Deers want something to eat, and those nutritious elements are in open fields, and lions need to eat, and the entities they want to eat are fast, and they could injure them, right? So these are like the problems that exist in this kind of a dynamic between lions and deers, let's say, right? That they are like locked in an environment. Now, of course, there are ways that each action faces a reaction, evolutionarily speaking, or it could, right? If you have like very fast lions, then the slow deers will get eaten, and the only deers that survive are going to be the fast ones. So that means the slow lions now don't have the competitive advantage, and like then lions get faster. But whatever there is in that kind of like environment is not so much about like a very kind of complicated radical change of the narrative. The narrative seems to be kind of stable. Again, this is a claim that I don't have any problem with facing objection to, because it's not going to change anything about Buehler's argument. I'm just making this simplified example to just kind of make the difference that exists in humanity a little bit more obvious. The difference in humanity is that we are a very psychologically active entity, right? It's not that we are only like reacting to like how fast like a specific member is. We are just always kind of like coming up with new kind of solutions, and every solution is a problem for someone else. If I have found new ways for manipulation that kind of bypasses the original hierarchical system within a society, now that and puts at risk people who have been surviving in that society comfortably so far, then there is a need for adaptation. The people who don't adapt to the new manipulative structure that I have introduced, they're not going to survive. The people who are going to survive have the quote-unquote pathogen to that manipulative strategy. But when they have that pathogen, that counter manipulation, then that puts selective pressure on that portion of the society, population that has the manipulation to get better at what they're doing, or go a completely new way, a new route. This is what Buehler means that our psychological layers have been evolved in lockstep, right? That we're just like constantly reacting to something new from the environment, right? And when me and Trent were discussing this, we were like thinking about the unfortunate historical fact about our countries about revolutions. That revolutions that kind of, first of all, revolutions themselves are fascinating in terms of this kind of like change of the logic, right? Again, like in amongst lions, like you have some males challenging alpha males, but you don't have like a, you know, Islamic revolution. Like you don't have that kind of ideological shift, which has very important consequences for instance, what are the correct mating mechanisms here? Who is going to have the resources? What kind of resources? What is going to be the, way to get the resources? What is the way to pretend you have the resources? What is the way that curb the resources? What is the way that you might create like an alternative value system within those value systems to get some other path to access to some resources, and so on and so forth. Like when those things happen within human societies, we need to be ready to change our strategies, change our sensitivities. Something that yesterday was the sign of high status, tomorrow is the sign that if you're associated with, you're going to be hanged. You are not going to survive the day after. So if you're stuck with understanding hierarchy, mating opportunities, resources in a certain way, you would disappear very soon because things change, right? Now, not every moment of human history is dealing with revolutions in this kind, but every moment of human history has certain pressures of that kind that will guarantee that no stable, uniform environment will exist. As a result, no stable adaptive problems will exist. They only exist as abstractions of this general term status problem, right? In so far as evolutionary development is concerned, there are new and new and new and new. There is no stability in the radical sense of the term in those processes. This also is true about niche construction in general, that once you have a niche that is basically a construction that human beings or other animals find themselves in, then this is going to create new selective pressures. Now, the fact that we have been able to kind of throw ourselves as new environments, and in these environments could be new hierarchies, for instance, or new like urban structure, right? That should tell us that we're always kind of like dealing with this kind of new selection pressures. Remember that I think Buehler could respond to a criticism by evolutionary psychologists here that they will say that such niche construction did not see any sort of a radical difference during the hunter-gatherer time by two ways. Number one is it didn't have such radical revolution if you have a very specific idea of what radical evolution means or radical change in an environment means. And two, by that could only make sense if the arms race problem is not in place, the impermanence of the problem is not um, um, present, meaning that even if you're in a hunter-gatherer society that not nominally is just like, let's say it's a 10,000 years of the same hunter-gatherer society, that does not mean that the rules of interaction, rules of hierarchy, rules for status have been stable. I can clearly see that a single hunter-gatherer society in its history would get to like have a very different understanding of different taboos or their extent of those taboos, different understanding of what is qualified as a status, what is qualified as family, what is qualified as mark of access to resources, not just because the environments could have been very different from one another, but also because we are each other's environment. And I think that's the basic point about the arms race of adaptation. That even if you throw a bunch of human beings within the exact same, outwardly speaking, social system, they're always changing it psychologically by adapting to the psychological strategies of their competitors or their cooperators. And because that exists within every single social configuration, Buehler suggests that there cannot be any stable environment, there cannot be any stable problem, and therefore there cannot be any stable solution.
Yes, you give us a lot of information and anecdotes, and very helpful. I want to kind of respond by connecting some of the points you've made. I think the comparison between the so-called co-evolution of like deers and lions, juxtaposing that with the development of, say, evolutionary history of a human mind is very helpful here. First, I think Buehler emphasizes that human beings are way more powerful in constructing niche, and human brain or mind is a very important element or actor in this niche constructing process. So unlike the development of muscle of certain body part of a deer or a lion, that their specific objective of developing this mechanism is fixed somehow. For instance, for the lions to be able to be faster than the slowest the deer, and for deers not to be the slowest deer among its crowd. That's no matter how fast the deer peers run or they run, that objective would remain stable. However, for human beings, because we are so good at the construction niche, to the extent most of the concrete selected adaptive problems are not stuff of imposed or determined by our relationship with another species, but rather determined by our relationship with other human beings. And when we acquire certain psychological mechanism or trait or possibilities, for instance, the ability to lie or deceit, to lie about how much we did for a collective project in like collecting or gathering, another psychological mechanism would necessarily come to place to urge it from the frequency distribution model to maintain that equilibrium. Certain anti-deceive mechanism would come up. And this, I think that's what you meant with the concept of armor race. Whenever one the specific significant minority of this group will come up with a specific mechanism to gain certain advantage in this competition, very concretely defined, is to lie about how much work you did in collecting berries so that you have like the mating right, say. Not just mating problem or like food gathering problem. Then it not only is a certain other mechanism would rival to come to place to check this specific mechanism, but also the problem both mechanisms are dealing with also changes during this process of like rivalry or arm race. So the arm race of psychological capability for the evolutionary history of human mind itself radically changes the or actively changes the problem and try to solve. So we don't have a stable problem as a reference to chart the evolution of one specific teleologically determined psychological mechanism, which is the oversimplified version presented by evolutionary psychologists, whom Buehler is criticizing here. Yes.
Yes. Very quick note. I think that the point about teleology is going to be very important in our later conversations, because I think it's very interesting that it's like kind of like in retrospect something seeming like teleological, as opposed to something being teleological, right? There might be a very meaningful way to kind of gather up certain mechanisms or even behaviors themselves as related to the problem of mating. But we need to understand that just because we can do that meaningfully, if possible, that doesn't mean that that tells us the story of how those things came about and what is the meaning of those things. I think that's the basic idea here. The last thing that we're going to discuss in this episode is the key lock fallacy that I really like, and I think that's another kind of important layer that I think evolutionary theory in general has great potential in activating this conceptual domain, which is that there is a point that evolutionary psychology seems to be making, that because coordinated genetic structuring of a biological entity is a very hard and easy to collapse process, there is some form of there is a need for some form of a complex design. What Buehler is mentioning is that the adaptive solutions are basically just constant modifications in the face of ever-evolving problems, right? They're not meticulously designed keys for easily identifiable locks, right? That's very important because when we think about natural selection, the distinction is not just between coarse problems or refined problems. The problem also kind of slips over another type of a problem, and that problem is what kind of a thing can be a solution, right? Because we want to think that, okay, we have this problem, and natural selection is just like, okay, what is the neat, clean, clear way to kind of solve that problem, right? No reason to think that way. The neatness is not something that we can attribute to the process of natural selection, because whatever lock you throw as an adaptive problem, right, we need to notice. You don't necessarily need to find the key to the lock. You can drill the lock. You can use a saw to create a hole in the door, or you can just use a hammer to break the side window. You don't need to be this kind of a very direct, immediate, easily identifiable answer, right? You can just go around the problem in a very sophisticated ways. all as like, making it as going forward. There is no like, understanding of, okay, if I use this as a solution right now, then this is gonna be a problem in the next 5 generations. No, screw it. Like, you've got this problem, just kill this person, eat the liver, and like move on. Like, it's just like gonna be like weird solutions that are gonna pop up. The key lock metaphor, in other words, is thinking about problems as easily identifiable as locks and solutions as easily identifiable keys. And that neatness does not exist in nature. Number one, as we said, the locks are not clear, right? There is no like grand view that says that here like is the list of the problems that exist. Here are the locks. Let's go look for the keys, right? They're just things happening. Like, there is no grand story that is happening from the perspective of nature. Right? Even if there were locks, right? And in some cases, we can argue for more identifiable locks as opposed to others. If there are such locks, then there is no reason to assume the solution to the lock is the key. Our way of dealing with the problems is always fine-tuned, immediate, and based on constant modifications that are just kind of piling up, right? It's ever evolving without the kind of a banality of the term. They're ever evolving not because we're just changing all the time, because there are so many different ways to identify problems. There's so many different ways to identify solutions. And this kind of a paradigm that exists in evolutionary psychology that is very much dependent on here are the neat problems, here are the neat solutions, does not seem to match the mess.
Yes, like what you said, and I think this is a great way to kind of summarize what we discussed so far in this episode. I think a good way to do that is to compare Buller's understanding of human mind versus those that he criticizes understanding of it. For instance, I think it's great to think for people like Tubi, human mind is a engineer who has like toolbox, and there are like numerous the tools neatly designed, each for a specific task in there. But for like a Buller, that person is like a great improviser. Like, here's a problem, sure. I'll look around, see whatever tools I have, and use it in a very creative way to solve that problem and move on to the next problem. Because every problem presents itself is very different from the previous problem. There is no stable problem that would be in my life for the entirety of my life. And of course, the life we're talking here is not about individualized, but like history of human evolution. And that's why for Tubi, he really needs to essentialize. First, dispense with the differences of like among a community, the hunter-gatherer communities, to produce essentialize the concept of ancestral environment. Such and such problems that remain universal and stable in such community for 2 million years, no change. Therefore, this problem is like omnipresent, and in order to survive, we must come up with a very specialized key to solve that, to open that door, which is like a barred, its access is barred because of the presence of lock. So the neatness is based on a myth of stability in the environment, as well as the rigid nature or non-adaptive nature of human mind. Human mind is a product of cumulative adaptation or adapted state, but not itself an active adapting machine or adapting process. I think that's the kind of assumption pointed out by Buller's criticism. No, you ruled out that possibility only because you assumed our ancestral environment is essentialized and stable in the first place, and you have absolutely no evidence for its stability, as you claims. So the neatness of a key lock, I think, points out to the fundamental different assumptions between these two groups of scholars about what the human mind is really trying to do and psychology is really about, and how do we deal with the discernible propensity of our psychological behaviors versus the really diverse and domain-specific challenges faced by individual human beings across history. Yes, that's my response to what you said.
Yes, and as a matter of kind of, I think that summarizes our points here very well. Bueller has a positive story to tell about this. Like all of these things that we mentioned about this problem of identifying problems, which, by the way, it's not just even the problem of historical analysis. I think it could be even brought up about like understanding what is actually a problem, right, at the very moment. Like I don't think that is out of the table. Like we have both of those problems. One problem might be much harder than the other, but that is itself a problem. In any case, like this kind of like volatility of problems, this problem of arms race of adaptation that exists, especially in human beings, because we're always in this kind of a lockstep of reacting to one another, and we need to be ready for that. We need to be versatile in those changes of behavior, and they kind of like feed off of one another, and they kind of just start a loop that just becomes continuous. And because there are like these kind of like we are in need of this kind of like tiny little modifications here and there, and just always kind of vastly kind of flexible in some ways, and flexible in the way that even like our solutions could be just radically different from like a very obvious solution that you might think of, hence the problem with the key lock metaphor. With all of this, Builder wants to put the spotlight on the concept of plasticity. And the concept of plasticity is what we're going to deal with next time.
So
Thanks for...
Well, I'll do the conclusion, all right, outro. I should have a guitar solo section here. All right, so dear listeners, thanks for your attention. Stay tuned. Our discussion about the Buller's alternative account of the human mind, plasticity, is coming up.